Welcome to the Whitman Ball Murder by Merrill Chadwick, narrated by Mitchell Larson. Published by brooksaudiobooks.com. All rights reserved. No portion of this audiobook may be reproduced in any form without written permission of the publisher. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks, and be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 1. That night I might have been the least remarkable girl in the room, but I was also the happiest, until 1 o'clock hit. Then my world began to unravel, or at least it felt like it was being overshadowed. Allow me to explain how and why this happened. I had often told myself that I was not made for love. I had reiterated this thought more than ever recently. I was too small in stature, and in all honesty, not conventionally pretty enough to entertain any expectations in that realm. Love had never been part of my life plan, as evidenced by the nursing diploma I had just earned after 3 years of rigorous study and training. I was simply not cut out for romance. Yet, had things been different, if I had been taller, more traditionally attractive, or even possessed that charm of expression that could overlook all flaws except those that were truly unappealing, I knew exactly whose attention I would have wanted to capture, whose heart I would have aspired to win. This realization struck me with an intensity I could hardly describe. Did I say heart? Perhaps I should say intellect, which is a different matter altogether. When just after the first dance, I looked up from the cluster of girls surrounding me and spotted Anson Monroe's striking figure making his way from the section of the hall where our host and hostess stood to greet their guests. His gaze was searching, his demeanor both eager and hopeful. Whom was he looking for? Surely one of the many vibrant girls nearby, as he quickly turned our direction. But which one? A thought flickered in my mind. I recalled where I had first met him, and the times I had seen him since then. She was enchanting, quick-witted and lively, and at that very moment she stood beside me. In her beauty lay the natural allure for a man of his talents and striking presence. If I watched closely, I would soon see his face brighten with recognition when she acknowledged him. And I was right. In a moment it happened, and with a brightness I couldn't ignore. There's a feeling that every human heart shares, infusing warmth and expressiveness into one's features. It made him look so handsome, so distinguished, everything I wasn't except. But what does this mean? He walked right past Miss Sperry, greeted her with a smile and a friendly word, and now he was speaking to me, singling me out, offering me his arm. He smiled at me, not like he did with Miss Sperry, but with a warmth and personal touch that felt special. In a daze, I took his arm. The lights were dimmer than I expected. Nothing shone as brightly as his smile. It felt like it changed my entire world. I forgot I was plain, forgot I was small, with nothing to catch the eye or heart, and allowed myself to be led away, asking nothing, expecting nothing, until we found ourselves alone in the fragrant corners of the conservatory, the soft thrum of music around us connecting us to the lively scene we just left. Why had he brought me into this enchanting place filled with opalescent lights and intoxicating scents? What could he possibly want to say or show? In the next moment, I knew. He took my hands, and love, deep and passionate, flowed from his lips. Could this be real? Was I truly the focus of this affection me? If so, then my life had truly transformed. Overwhelmed by emotion, I searched his face, wondering if this paradise, to which he was inviting me so fervently, was real or just a dream sparked by the excitement of the dance and the beauty of a scene so exquisite, even for such a luxurious city like New York. But it was no mere illusion. There was truth and sincerity in his demeanor, and his words weren't frantic or forced. "I love you, I need you," I heard him say, and soon he made me believe it. "You've enchanted me from the very start. Your captivating, trustworthy, and devoted self, unlike anyone else, sweeter than all others, has stolen my heart. I have encountered many women and admired quite a few, but you are the only one I have ever truly loved. Will you marry me?" I was astonished, overwhelmed in a way I had never imagined. All the thoughts I had earlier told myself, all the resolutions I had tried to instill in my heart as I saw him approach, believing he sought another woman, faded away. Trusting in his sincerity and relying completely on his love, I let go of years of plans in the enchantment of this new joy, and I spoke the word that joined us in a bond I had never dreamed would tie me to any man. His fervent "mine, mine," filled my heart to the brim. A sense of ecstatic life surged through my soul, transforming my world, making everything that had come before seem merely a prelude to this new life and new joy. Oh, how happy I was, perhaps too happy. As the conservatory filled up and we moved back into the next room, the glimpse of myself in one of the mirrors caught me off guard. Had it not been for the peculiar color of my dress and the unusual way I wore my hair that evening, I might not have recognized the radiant girl who smiled back at me so innocently from the reflective glass. Can one truly be too happy? I'm not sure. But I do know that one can definitely feel overwhelmed, burdened, and deeply sad. Up to this point, I have only shared my feelings about that magnificent evening. Even though my old Dutch lineage entitled me to a certain level of social standing, which I am pleased to say never let me down, even in this moment of immense joy, I captured very little attention and stirred little comment. There was another woman present who was far more capable of doing that. A striking woman, large and exuding a magnetic charm, was accustomed to winning hearts and effortlessly carried her triumphs with a lazy grace that was utterly captivating to an ordinary man. She was dressed in lavish attire, adorned with a diamond on her breast that sparkled so brightly it seemed almost too much for any woman, herself included. I noticed that diamond early in the evening, and it drew my attention to her. While she wasn't as flawless as the gemstone, she was certainly captivating. In a more composed state, I might have envied the attention she received from all the men around her, including the one whose arm I was leaning on. But later, I found that he was the last person I envied. The ball was a private affair, exceptionally elegant, attended by some prominent guests. One gentleman in particular caught my eye. He was an Englishman of significant distinction and political relevance. I found him intriguing for his age, yet he appeared somewhat odd and a bit self-absorbed. Despite all the attention he received, he seemed strangely restless under the constant scrutiny of so many eyes, appearing happiest when he could pull away and observe the lively scene around him. Had I not been so wrapped up in my own joy, I might have noticed sooner that his gaze tended to drift toward the groups surrounding the lady with the diamond. But I failed to register this at the time, so I was quite taken aback when, at the end of one dance, I stumbled upon him speaking with her in a lively and courteous manner that was a stark contrast to the indifference, even boredom, he had shown to others up until then. Yet his display of interest did not seem tied to admiration for her beauty. Throughout their conversation, his eyes rarely met her face. Instead, they remained fixed, and this piqued my curiosity, on the large fan of ostrich feathers she held against her chest. Was he longing to catch a glimpse of the impressive diamond that she so unconsciously, or perhaps consciously, shielded from his view? As I observed him more closely, I noticed that he suddenly leaned toward her, only to lift himself back up again, wearing an expression that left me puzzled. The lady had adjusted her fan for a moment, and his gaze had landed on the gem it concealed. The next thing I distinctly remember is having an intimate conversation with my lover on a certain yellow divan at the end of one of the halls. To the right of this divan stood a curtained recess, suggestive of romance, and known as the alcove. Since this alcove plays a significant role in my story, I will take a moment to describe it. Originally, it was meant to house a grand set of statuary that our host, Mr. Whitman, had commissioned from Italy to adorn his new home. He's a man with innovative ideas about decor, and in this case, he even had the end of the house constructed specifically to showcase the anticipated artwork. Concerned about how a massive pedestal would dominate the space, he designed the alcove floor to be a few feet higher than the main floor, allowing for an eye-level display. A wide, gentle staircase joined the two levels, following the curve of the wall and enhancing the beauty of that part of the hall. Unfortunately, the statue group was never shipped, but the alcove remained. With all the warmth and light you would find in a proper room, it transformed into a cozy retreat of remarkable charm. The privacy it provided seemed, or so we dared to believe, to extend to the solitary divan at its base, where Mr. Monroe and I were seated. With perhaps a touch of overconfidence in our secluded position, we were discussing a topic that was likely of little interest to anyone but ourselves when Mr. Monroe suddenly declared, "You are the woman I want, you and no one else. And I want you soon. When do you think you can marry me? Within a week, F." Did my expression silence him? I was taken aback. I had never heard him speak such an incoherent thought before. "A week," I exclaimed. "We take longer than that to prepare for a trip or some fleeting enjoyment. I can hardly grasp my engagement yet." "You haven't been contemplating it for the past 2 months as I have." "No," I replied modestly, momentarily forgetting everything else in my joy at this revelation. "And you're not a wanderer among clubs and restaurants?" "No, I have a home." "Nor do you love me as fiercely as I love you." I thought that was open for discussion. "The home you refer to is a lavish one," he continued. "I cannot promise you an equal. Do you expect that of me?" I felt a surge of indignation. "You know I do not. Should I, who willingly chose a nurse's life when I could have stayed in an indulgent uncle's comfortable home, shy away from facing hardship with the man I love? We can begin as humbly as you wish." "No," he interrupted firmly, though a certain reluctance in his tone hinted at doubts he could hardly admit to himself. "I will not marry you if it means subjecting you to hardship or the genteel poverty I despise. I love you more than you realize and want to make your life happy. I cannot provide for you everything you are used to in your uncle's wealthy house, but if things go well for me, if the venture I'm depending on works out, and it will succeed or fail tonight, you will have those comforts that love will transform into luxuries, and—" He was becoming incoherent again, this time fixing his gaze elsewhere instead of on my face. Following his line of sight, I saw what had caught his attention. The woman with the diamonds was approaching us, making her way to the alcove. She was accompanied by 2 gentlemen, both strangers to me, her head sparkling with jewels as she gracefully shifted her gaze from one to the other. I wasn't surprised when the man beside me shivered and almost stood up. She was stunning. Next to her impressive figure in that flowing robe of rich pink velvet, my own small frame in its sea-green gown must have appeared as dull and washed out as a faded pastel. "She's quite a woman," I said, noticing that he didn't seem likely to continue our conversation, which her presence had interrupted. "And that diamond." He gave me a strange look. "Did you notice it particularly?" he asked. I was taken aback. There was something unsettling in his demeanor, and I half expected him to get up and join the group he was watching so intently without waiting for me to respond. I quickly said, "How could I miss it? It's the sort of jewel you'd expect to see only on a queen's dress, but perhaps she is a queen. I gathered that much from the reverence surrounding her." He searched my eyes. There was a question there, but it was one I couldn't grasp. "What do you know about diamonds?" he eventually asked. "Only their sparkle, and not all glitter is worth something. The gem she wears could be quite cheap." I felt a rush of embarrassment. He was a gem dealer after all, and his skepticism about my enthusiasm made me acutely aware of my own arrogance. Still, I wasn't ready to back down. I had a better view of this remarkable jewel than he did, and feeling a bit flustered, I blurted out as soon as my cheeks lost their color, "No, no. It is stunning, magnificent. I've never seen anything like it. I doubt you have either, despite your daily dealings with jewels. Its worth must be tremendous." "Who is she? You seem to know her." It was a straightforward question, but I got no answer. "Mr." Monroe's gaze had followed the lady as she lingered a bit too obviously on the top step, not returning to me until she had disappeared behind the long plush curtain that partially concealed the entrance. At that point, he had likely forgotten my words, if he had even heard them at all. With an effort to sound lively, though it was clear his thoughts were elsewhere, he returned to his familiar request. When would I agree to marry him? If he could provide a home within a month, and he would know by tomorrow if that was possible, would I join him then? He hesitated to propose a week. That felt too soon. But a month? Would I be willing to promise him my hand in that time? I barely recall my response. His attention had drifted back to the alcove, and mine had followed suit. The gentlemen who had accompanied the lady inside were now emerging, but others were arriving to take their place. Soon she was receiving a steady stream of admirers in that favoured nook. Why was I even paying attention to her? What compelled me to glance that way? Perhaps it was because Mr. Monroe did. I couldn't help but feel a bit resentful that he would share his focus like this. I thought that, at least for this evening, he might have chosen to overlook the charms of a mere coquette. As I found myself torn between listening to my lover and watching the various gentlemen moving up and down the steps, a former partner approached and reminded me that I had promised him a waltz. Reluctant to leave Mr. Monroe, and unable to find a way to excuse myself to Mr. Fox, I shot an apologetic glance at him, only to feel annoyed to see him already on his feet. "Enjoy your dance," he called out cheerfully. "I need to have a word with Mrs. Sinclair," and he was off before my new partner could take my arm. Was Mrs. Sinclair the lady wearing the diamond? As I turned to step into the parlour with my partner, I caught a glimpse of Mr. Monroe's tall figure, just vanishing from the doorway behind the sage-green curtains. "Who is Mrs. Sinclair?" I asked Mr. Fox as the dance came to an end. Mr. Fox, a familiar face in society, was well acquainted with everyone. She was Nurse Sinclair's wife. You know Sinclair, the millionaire who built that peculiar structure on 86th Street. Right now they're living apart, though it's all very friendly, I believe. Her diamond makes her stand out. It's one of the most extraordinary stones in New York, maybe even in the whole country. Have you seen it?" "Yes, at a distance anyway. Do you think she's very beautiful?" "Mrs. Sinclair, she, referred to as such, but she's not really my type." He shot me a pointed look. "I prefer women with intellect and warmth. They don't need to flaunt jewels worth a small fortune." I glanced around, searching for a reason to escape this somewhat less than appealing partner. "Let's head back into the long hall," I suggested. "The endless motion of these dancers is making me dizzy." With the grace of a true gentleman, he offered me his arm, and we were soon strolling towards the alcove. As we turned to retrace our steps in front of the yellow divan, I caught a brief glimpse inside. The woman with the diamond was still there. A fold of her stunning pink velvet dress hung draped across the gap created by the half-closed curtains, just as it had half an hour before. Yet I could not see her face or identify who was with her. What I could see, however, was a man leaning against the wall at the bottom of the steps. At first I thought he was a stranger, but then I realized he was none other than the guest of honor for the evening, the Englishman I had mentioned earlier. His expression had changed. He appeared both anxious and deeply focused, almost enough to deter anyone from approaching him. I couldn't help but wonder and question who or what was keeping him occupied. Was he waiting for Mr. Monroe to finish speaking with the lady? That seemed unlikely. I couldn't believe Mr. Monroe would still be there. Yet some women have a way of making it hard for a man to leave their side. Acknowledging that, I cast a final look over my shoulder as I gave in to Mr. Fox's urging and headed toward the supper-room. As I turned, I caught sight of the Englishman lifting 2 cups of coffee from a small table near the door to the reception room. His demeanor made it clear where he was headed with the drinks, and in that moment my apprehension faded away. I settled at one of the small tables crowded in the supper-room, allowing myself, for a few minutes at least, to listen to Mr. Fox's tiresome flattery and cliched thoughts. However, my attention soon drifted. Though I hadn't moved or shifted my gaze from the usual lively scene unfolding in the room, I suddenly found myself gazing, as if through a haze I hadn't even noticed forming, at something strange, unusual, and distant, almost like a phantom. Yet it was clear enough for me to get a strong impression of a bright square of light surrounding a man in an oddly distinctive pose, one difficult to imagine or describe. The moment passed in an instant, and I found myself staring out the window opposite me, feeling as if I had just witnessed something extraordinary. Yet, almost immediately, I disregarded the fleeting vision, consumed instead by my worry about Mr. Monroe. He must have been preoccupied elsewhere, or he would have found a chance to join me by now. He wasn't even in sight, and I grew tired of the endless menu and the pointless chatter of my companion. Finding him agreeable to my whims, I rose from my place at the table and headed toward a group of acquaintances standing just outside the dining-room door. As I listened to their greetings, a sudden urge made me glance down the hall toward the alcove. A man, a waiter, burst out in a hurry. The bad news was evident on his face, and as he locked eyes with Mr. Whitman, who was quickly approaching him, he rushed down the steps with a cry that gathered a crowd around them in an instant. What was going on? What had happened? Overcome with a frantic anxiety I couldn't identify, I rushed toward the group, now swaying restlessly with excitement, when suddenly everything started to spin before me, and I collapsed in a faint onto the floor. Someone had shouted, "Mrs. Sinclair has been murdered and her diamonds stolen. Lock the doors." Chapter 2. I must have been out of it for quite a while, for when I finally regained my senses, the supper room was empty. The 200 guests I had just left seated at the table were now in anxious clusters around the hall. That was my first realization. It wasn't until later that I understood my own predicament. I found myself lying on a couch in a secluded corner of the same hall, and beside me, though not looking my way, stood my lover, Mr. Monroe. I didn't question how he had come to know I was in trouble or how he found me amidst the chaos. At that moment, just seeing him so close was enough. The relief washed over me, and his protective presence was deeply comforting. I instinctively reached out my hand toward him in gratitude, but when I failed to catch his eye, I slipped off the couch and went to stand beside him. This seemed to draw his attention, and he turned to me with a look that steadied me, despite the shock I felt at seeing his pale expression and the unusual hesitance in his manner, which was unlike him. Meanwhile, I could hear someone speaking nearby, their words slowly cutting through my foggy thoughts. A waiter, the one who had first raised the alarm, was trying to explain to a demanding group what he had found in that dreadful alcove. "I was carrying a tray of ices," he said, "and when I saw the lady sitting there I approached. I'd expected the area to be full of gentlemen, but she was completely alone and didn't move as I carefully stepped over her long train. The next moment I dropped the ices and the tray. I came face to face with her and saw that she was dead. She'd been stabbed and robbed. There was no diamond on her breast, but there was blood." A cacophony of horrified gasps and disordered exclamations followed this straightforward account. Then a surge of movement occurred as people began heading toward the alcove, during which Mr. Monroe leaned closer and whispered in my ear, "We need to get out of here. You're not strong enough to handle all this excitement. Do you think we can escape through that window over there?" "What, without our coats and in a snowstorm like this?" I protested. "Besides, my uncle is looking for me. He came with me, you know." A look of annoyance, or perhaps confusion, flashed across Mr. Monroe's face, and he started to turn away from me. "I must go," he said, but then he noticed my surprised expression and adopted a calmer demeanor, one that suited him much better. "Forgive me, dear, I will take you to your uncle. This terrible tragedy interrupting such a joyful occasion has quite unsettled me. I've always been sensitive to the sight, the smell, even the mention of blood." So was I, but I wasn't paralyzed by it. However, I hadn't just come from an encounter with a murdered woman. Her glances, her smiles, the way her eyebrows lifted were not vivid memories for me. I could certainly understand the shock he must be feeling. Still, I couldn't suppress the burning question. "Who did it? You must have heard someone mention it." "I haven't heard anything," he replied somewhat sharply. Then, as I started to move, he asked, "Don't you want to follow the crowd?" "I want to find my uncle, and he's with that crowd." Mr. Monroe didn't say anything more, so we moved down the hall together. A strange feeling washed over me. Instead of wanting to escape a scene that would usually have made me feel completely disgusted, I found myself wanting to see and hear everything. Not out of curiosity like most of the people around me, but driven by a deep instinct I couldn't quite grasp. It felt as if my heart had been struck, and my fate hung precariously in the balance. We were among the first to hear the details that were allowed to trickle out among the now nearly frantic guests. No one knew who had committed the act, nor was there any clear evidence pointing to the identity of the culprit. The sudden death of this lovely woman amidst the festivities might have been interpreted as suicide, were it not for the missing jewel from her breast and the weapon taken from the wound. So far, the hasty search that had been initiated had failed to uncover the weapon. However, the police would arrive soon, and then action would be taken. As for how the assassin gained entry, there seemed to be a consensus. The alcove had a window that opened onto a small balcony. Surely, he had entered and escaped through there. The long plush curtains, which had been pulled back during the early part of the evening, were now found tightly closed at the time the crime was discovered. This was certainly a suspicious detail. Nonetheless, it was a question that could be easily resolved. If anyone had approached by the balcony, there would be footprints in the snow to prove it. Mr. Whitman had gone out to check. He would be back soon. "Do you really think this is a likely explanation for the crime?" I asked Mr. Monroe at that moment. "If I recall correctly, this window looks out over the carriage drive. It must be clearly visible from the door through which 300 guests have passed tonight. How could anyone climb up, lift the window, and slip inside without being seen?" "You're forgetting the awning," he replied quickly, his voice unexpectedly lively. "The awning is positioned very close to this window and effectively blocks it from the view of guests arriving. The drivers of departing carriages might spot it if they happen to glance back, but in such a crowd, their focus is usually on their horses. The odds are against any of them having looked up." His brow had relaxed. A sense of relief seemed to lift from his mind. When I entered the alcove to see Mrs. Sinclair, she was sitting in a chair by this window, gazing outside. I can recall how striking she looked against the snowfall that drifted down steadily behind her. The pink velvet of her gown, the soft green curtains framing the window, her brilliant jewels, against that snowy backdrop. Yes, the murderer must have approached that way. Anyone outside would have easily seen her, and if she moved, that diamond would have caught the light. Can't you see how plausible this theory is? There must be ways for a desperate man to reach that balcony, I believe. How eager he was, and the intensity of his gaze sharpened when the news began to spread through the crowd that, while footprints had been discovered in the snow leading directly to the balcony, there were none on the balcony itself, indicating, as anyone could conclude, that the attack did not come from outside, since no one could access the alcove by the window without stepping on the balcony. "Mr. Monroe has his own suspicions," I told myself firmly. "He encountered someone going in just as he was coming out. Should I ask him to name this person? No, I couldn't muster the courage, not while his face was so stern and resolutely turned away. The next wave of excitement came with Mr. Whitman's request for us to move into the drawing-room. This led to various cries from frantic voices, such as, "They're going to search us. He thinks the thief and murderer are still in the house. Do you see the diamond on me? Why don't they limit their suspicions to those few who were allowed into the alcove?" "They will," someone whispered close to my ear. But when I turned quickly, I failed to see who had spoken. Perhaps it was the heavily adorned, elderly lady whose gaze was fixed on Mr. Monroe's turned-away face. If that was the case, she shot me a defiant look that I'm sure she didn't forget any time soon. Unfortunately, it wasn't the only curious, almost probing gaze I caught aimed at him while we made our way toward my uncle, who was struggling to reach us from a nearby hallway. News had apparently spread that Mr. Monroe had been the last person to speak with Mrs. Sinclair before the tragedy struck. Eventually, I was able to join my uncle, who visibly relaxed at the sight of me. Encouraged by his warm smile, I introduced Mr. Monroe. My confident demeanor must have made an impression, because he turned to my companion with a startled, questioning look before taking my arm resolutely. "There's likely to be some unpleasantness ahead for all of us. I doubt the police will let anyone leave until they've searched for that diamond. This is a serious matter, dear. Many believe the murderer was one of the guests." "I believe that too," I replied. "Even now, I can't quite articulate why I felt so strongly about it." My uncle looked taken aback. "You should probably refrain from sharing opinions," he advised. "A lady like you shouldn't concern herself with such grim matters. I'll always regret bringing you here tonight. I'll seize the first chance to take you home. For now, we're expected to wait for our host's guidance." He can't keep everyone here for long, I ventured. No, most will likely be dismissed soon. You might want to fetch your coat, so you're ready to leave as soon as he gives the signal. I'd prefer to sneak a peek at the guests in the drawing-room first, I replied stubbornly. I don't know why I want to see them, but I do. And, Uncle, I should probably tell you that I've accepted Mr. Monroe is here this evening, the gentleman who was with you when you first arrived. You're saying you're engaged to him. To marry him, is that what you mean? I nodded, casting a quick glance behind me to see if Mr. Monroe was close enough to overhear. He wasn't, and I let my excitement spill out in a rush of words. He has picked me, I remarked, the plainest, most boring person in the whole city. My uncle smiled at me. And I believe he loves me, at least I know that I love him. My uncle sighed, while giving me a warm look. It's unfortunate that you've come to this understanding tonight, he said. He's connected to the murdered woman, and you should know that you'll have to leave him behind when it's time to go home. Everyone seen entering that alcove this evening will have to stay until the coroner arrives. We strolled toward the drawing-room, passing the library as we did. It had only one occupant, the Englishman. He sat at a table, his demeanor so intense that it discouraged any thought of interruption. The intensity in his gaze and the deep furrow on his brow indicated a mind in turmoil. I was too curious to delve into his thoughts, so I moved on, chatting casually as though I had no intention of stopping. I couldn't say how long went by before my uncle touched my arm, saying, "The police are here in full force. I just saw a plainclothes detective peek in here a moment ago. He seemed to be watching you. There he is again. What could he want? No, don't look. He's gone now." Terrified in a way I had never experienced before, I managed to keep my chin up and maintain an air of indifference. What could a detective possibly want from me, as my uncle said? I had nothing to do with the crime. In no way could I be linked to it. So why had I attracted the attention of the police? I looked around for Mr. Monroe. He had left my side when my uncle arrived, but I thought he would still be nearby. However, in that moment, he was nowhere to be found. Was I worried about him? No, that was out of the question. Yet. Just then, word spread that the police had instructed everyone, except those who were asked to stay and answer questions, to feel free to leave. It was time for me to take a stand, and I told my uncle, much to his displeasure, that I wouldn't leave as long as there was a reason to stay. He didn't reply immediately, but as the sound of departing carriages faded, and the grand hall and drawing-rooms began to feel empty, he finally offered a gentle protest. "You have more courage, Rita, than I expected. Do you think it's wise to stay here? Don't you think people will assume you've been asked to remain? Look at those waiters lingering in the doorways. Go upstairs and put on your coat. Mr. Monroe will come to the house as soon as he's free. I'll even allow you to wait for him if you want. Just let's leave this place before that insufferable man makes his way back," he suggested slyly. But I stood my ground, although his last remark did stir me a bit, and being a bit of a tyrant in my own way, at least with him, I got my way. Suddenly, a wave of anxiety hit me. A group of men came down the hall, and I recognized Mr. Monroe among them, led by a short but pompous figure whom my uncle quickly pointed out as the detective who had visited near where I stood on 2 occasions. As the man looked up and noticed I was still there, relief washed over his features. After exchanging a few words with another man who seemed to be in charge, he stepped away from the group he had been part of and approached me with a respectful demeanor, casting a wary glance at my uncle, whose frown he clearly recognized. "Miss Van Hayes, I believe?" he inquired. I nodded, too overwhelmed to respond. "I apologize if you were hoping to leave. Inspector Dalzell has arrived and wishes to speak with you. Would you mind stepping into one of these rooms? Not the library, but any other will do. He'll join you as soon as he can." I tried to appear calm and nonchalant, as if this summons was nothing unusual or alarming. However, I found myself unable to focus, my gaze flickering between him and the gathering of men he had just departed from. Among them were several gentlemen I had noticed earlier in Mrs. Sinclair's entourage, along with a few unfamiliar faces, 2 of whom appeared to be officials. Mr. Monroe was with the former, and his expression did little to reassure me. "The situation is quite serious," the detective remarked as he left me. "That's our excuse for any inconvenience we may be causing you." I grabbed hold of my uncle's arm. "Where shall we go?" I asked. "The drawing-room is too vast. Here in the hall my eyes keep straying toward the alcove. Don't you know of a smaller room? Oh, what could he possibly want from me?" "Nothing serious, nothing important," my well-meaning uncle said with a show of bravado. "Just some trivial matter you can address in no time. A small room. Yes, I know one, down there under the stairs. Come, let me find the door for you. Why did we ever come to this dreadful ball?" I had no answer for that. Why, indeed? My normally patient uncle guided me to the spot he had chosen without adding another word to the outburst of his earlier frustration. Once we were seated, safely away from prying eyes and attentive ears, he let out a heavy sigh that revealed just how agitated he truly was. "My dear," he started, then hesitated. "I feel," he paused again, "that you should know." "What is it?" I managed to ask. "That I do not trust Mr. Monroe, and that others feel the same." "Is it because of something you knew about him before tonight?" He remained silent. "Or was it because he was seen, like many gentlemen, speaking with that woman some time ago, long before she was attacked for her diamond and murdered?" "Forgive me, my dear, he was the last person seen speaking to her. Someone might eventually emerge who went in after he left, but for now he is regarded as the last. Mr. Whitman himself informed me of this." "It doesn't matter," I exclaimed, driven by the pent-up frustration that had been building within me. "I would stake my life on his integrity and honor. No man could have spoken to me as he did earlier this evening with any malicious intent. He was clearly intrigued, like many others, by someone known for her charm. But—" I suddenly halted, sensing a shift in my uncle's expression that told me we were no longer alone. Who had slipped in so quietly? Intrigued yet anxious, I turned to look. A gentleman stood in the doorway, smiling as our eyes met. "Is this Miss Van Hayes?" he inquired. My confidence, which had nearly vanished, surged back, and I returned his smile. "I am," I replied. "Are you the inspector?" "Inspector Dalzell," he said, with a bow that included my uncle. Then he closed the door behind him. "I hope I have not startled you," he continued, stepping closer with a refined demeanor. "A small matter has arisen that I intend to discuss candidly with you. It may turn out to be insignificant. If so, I hope you will forgive my interruption. Mr. Monroe, you know him?" "I'm engaged to him," I declared before my poor uncle could interject. "You're engaged to him? Well, that complicates things, yet in some ways it makes it easier for me to ask a particular question." It must have been more challenging than easy, for he didn't ask the question right away, but continued instead. "You know that Mr. Monroe visited Mrs. Sinclair in the alcove shortly before her death?" "I've heard that. He was seen entering, but I haven't found anyone who saw him leave. Therefore, we can't pinpoint the exact time he did. What's the matter, Miss Van Hayes? You seem like you want to say something." No, I protested, reevaluating my initial reaction. Then, as I met his gaze, I added, "He can probably tell you that himself. I'm certain he wouldn't hesitate." "We'll ask him later," the inspector replied. "In the meantime, can you assure me that since then he hasn't given you a little something to keep?" No, I don't mean the diamond," he interrupted, clearly alarmed as I recoiled from him in disbelief and anger. "The diamond? Well, we will search for that later. It's another item we're looking for now, one that Mr. Monroe could easily have picked up without realizing it. Since it's crucial for us to find this item, and he might have naturally handed it to you while he was in the hall, I felt it was necessary to ask if that's a possibility." "It is not," I shot back vehemently, relieved to speak my mind. "He hasn't given me anything to keep for him. He wouldn't." Why did the inspector have that strange look in his eye? Why did he reach for a chair and sit me down before picking up my interrupted sentence to finish it? "Wouldn't give you anything to hold that belonged to another woman. Miss Van Hayes, you don't understand men. They do things that a young, trusting girl like you would never expect. Not Mr. Monroe, I insisted firmly. Perhaps not. Let's hope that's true. Then, with a sudden shift in demeanor, he leaned closer, casting a quick glance at my uncle, and pointed at my gloves. You're wearing gloves. Did you feel the need for 2 pairs, since you're carrying another in that lovely bag hanging from your arm? I flinched, looked down, and slowly pulled up the bag he mentioned. The white tip of a glove poked out from the top. Anyone could see it, many probably had. What did it mean? I hadn't brought an extra pair with me. This isn't mine, I started, but fell silent as I noticed my uncle turning and walking a few steps away. The item we're after, he continued, is a pair of long, white gloves, believed to have been worn by Mrs. Sinclair when she entered the alcove. Do you mind showing me the one little finger I see? I dropped the bag into his hand. The room and everything in it spun around me, but when I saw how much trouble his clumsy fingers had opening it, my senses returned. I reached for the bag, pulled it open, and yanked out the gloves. They had been hastily rolled up, and some of the fingers were sticking out. Let me have them, he said. With a racing heart and trembling fingers, I handed over the gloves. Mrs. Sinclair's hands weren't small, he remarked as he slowly unrolled them. Yours are, we can tell quickly. But he never finished that sentence. As the gloves fell open in his grasp, he let out a sudden, sharp exclamation, and I stifled a scream. An object of extraordinary brilliance had tumbled from their midst. The diamond. The gem that people claimed was worth a king's ransom, and which we all understood had just claimed a life. Chapter 3. With my senses dulled, and a heavy heart, I stared at the fallen jewel as if it were some sinister threat to both my life and reputation. I had nothing to do with this, I insisted fiercely. I didn't put the gloves in my bag, nor did I know the diamond was in them. I fainted the moment the alarm sounded, and— There, I understand, the inspector interrupted gently. I believe you completely. It's just that there's a man who doubts. Miss Van Hayes, you should let your uncle take you home. I'll ensure the hall is cleared for you. Tomorrow I may need to speak with you again, but I won't trouble you any further tonight. I shook my head. It would take more courage to leave now than to stay. Meeting the inspector's gaze firmly, I said quietly, If Mr. Monroe's name is to be tarnished in any way, I won't abandon him. I trust his integrity, even if you don't. It wasn't his hand, but one far more culpable, that dropped this jewel into the bag. Ah, don't be too certain, little lady. You should take this lesson right away. It would be easier for you and better for him, he replied. He then picked up the jewel. Well, they were right about it being remarkable, he exclaimed, suddenly impressed. Now that I see this great gem, I understand the legendary tales I've read of men risking everything for such treasures. If only no blood had been shed. Uncle, uncle, I cried in despair. That was all I could manage to say, but it was enough for him. Speaking for the first time, he asked for a path to be cleared for us, and as the inspector moved to comply, he wrapped his arm around me, searching for the right words to fill the silence. Suddenly, we heard a brief argument from the doorway, and Mr. Monroe came rushing in, immediately followed by the inspector. His first glance wasn't at me, but at the bag still hanging from my arm. In that moment, my entire sense of self seemed to crumple, dragging my happiness down with it. Yet my expression remained unchanged, too unchanged, it seemed, because when his gaze finally met my face, he recoiled, a fierce look crossing his features as he turned towards his companion. You've spoken to her, he charged, his voice thick with indignation. Perhaps you've gone further than that. What's happened here? I deserve to know. She is so innocent, Inspector Dalzell, perfectly untouched by this crime. Why have you confined her here, interrogated her, and made her look at me like that when all you have against me is the fact that I was weak or unfortunate enough to spend a few minutes with that poor woman in the alcove before she died? It might be better if Miss Van Hayes herself answered that, the inspector replied calmly. What you've mentioned may be all we have against you, but it is not all we have against her. I gasped, not merely at this apparent accusation, one I believed I could understand. but at the deep flush that overtook Mr. Monroe. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice breaking oddly. "What could you possibly have against her?" "A minor detail," the inspector said, casting a glance my way that I knew was loaded with meaning. "I don't see it as a minor detail," I interjected sharply. "It appears Mrs. Sinclair, despite her finely put-together appearance, was found without gloves on her arms. Since she surely wore them when she entered the alcove, the police have naturally been searching for them. And where do you think they found them? Not in the alcove with her, not with the man who likely took them away, but—" I know, Mr. Monroe rasped. "You don't need to say anything more. Oh, my poor Rita, what have I brought upon you with my weakness?" "Weakness?" He flinched. I flinched, my voice sounding entirely foreign to me. "I could call it something else," I added icily. For a moment he seemed to falter, but then he straightened up again, looking as handsome as he did when he pleaded for my hand in that little conservatory. "You have every right to," he replied. "Besides, to act weak at a time like this, under these circumstances, is almost like a betrayal. It was unmanly of me to try to hide these gloves, and even worse to choose your own belongings as their hiding place. I admit it, Rita, and I will accept whatever punishment you think I deserve if you choose to withhold your sympathy and affection from me in the future. But I must assure both you and these gentlemen, one of whom could make my life quite uncomfortable, that my concern for you, far more than any selfish anxiety about myself, was the real reason behind what must seem to you like an act of unforgivable cowardice. From the moment I learned about the woman's murder in the alcove where I had visited her, I understood that anyone seen near her in the half-hour leading up to her death would be subjected to a severe investigation. I was afraid that if her gloves were found in my possession, it would draw unwanted attention to me, causing you distress that you didn't deserve. So, acting on a misguided impulse that I now realize was both foolish and shameful, I took advantage of the chaos around us and your faintness to slip those wretched gloves into the bag I saw at your feet. I don't expect your forgiveness. My entire future will be dedicated to winning that. I just want to state a fact." "Very well." It was the inspector who spoke. I couldn't have said a word to save my life. "Perhaps now you feel it's right to explain to this young lady how you came to possess those gloves." "Mrs. Sinclair gave them to me." "She gave them to you?" "Yes, I hardly understand why myself. She asked me to look after them for her. I know this must sound quite strange to you. It was the thought of how such an admission would be perceived that made me dread any further questions on the matter. But I assure you I'm telling the truth. She placed the gloves in my hand while we were talking, saying they were bothering her." "And you?" "Well, I held them for a few minutes, then I put them in my pocket, almost without thinking. She was a woman who was used to getting her way. People rarely questioned it, I suppose." At this, the tightness in my throat eased, and I opened my mouth to speak. But the inspector, with a look of authority, interrupted me. "Were the gloves open, or rolled up when she offered them to you?" "They were rolled up." "Did you see her take them off?" "Of course." "And roll them up?" "Certainly." "After which she handed them to you?" "Not right away. She let them sit in her lap for a while." "While you talked?" Mr. Monroe nodded. "And looked at the diamond?" Mr. Monroe nodded again. "Had you ever seen a diamond that fine before?" "No." "Yet you deal in precious stones." "That's my trade." "Are you considered an expert in them?" "I have that reputation." "Mr. Monroe, would you recognize this diamond if you saw it again?" "I certainly would." "The setting was quite unusual, I hear." "Very unusual." The inspector opened his hand. "Is this the piece?" "Good heavens." "Well, don't you know?" "I don't." The inspector regarded him seriously. "Then I have something to tell you. It was concealed in the gloves you took from Mrs. Sinclair. Miss Van Hayes witnessed their unrolling." Do we truly live, move, and breathe in certain moments? It hardly feels that way. I was aware of only one sense, the sense of sight, and only one ability, the ability to judge. Would he flinch, break down, show guilt, or merely display surprise? I chose to believe it was just surprise that was etched on his gradually paling and troubled features. Certainly that was all his words conveyed, as his gaze darted from the stone to the gloves and back to the inspector's face. "I can't believe it. I can't believe it." His hand flew to his forehead in an agitated gesture. "But it is the truth, Mr. Monroe, and now you must confront it. How will you handle this? With more explanations, or what you might deem a discreet silence?" "I have nothing to explain. The facts are as I've stated." The inspector looked at him with a seriousness that made my heart sink. "I hope you can recall the timing of your visit. Tell us when you left the alcove. Surely you must have seen someone who can vouch for you." "I'm afraid not." Why did he seem so shaken and uncertain? "There were only a few people in the hall at that moment," he continued to explain. "No one was sitting on the yellow divan." "Do you at least know where you went, who you spoke to, and what you did before the alarm sounded?" "Inspector, I'm quite disoriented. I did go somewhere. I didn't stay in that part of the hall. But I can't tell you anything specific, except that I wandered around, mostly among strangers, until the cry went up that sent us all rushing in one direction, and I found myself by the side of my fainting sweetheart." "Can you identify any stranger you spoke with, or anyone who might have noticed you during that time?" "You see, for the sake of this little woman, I want to give you every chance." "Inspector, I must appeal to your mercy. I have no witness to confirm my innocence as you require. Innocent people seldom have that. It is only the guilty who go to the trouble of preparing for such situations." This reasoning might have held weight if it had been delivered with confidence and clarity. But it was. I, who cared for him deeply, sensed that it lacked sincerity, and so I was somewhat ready for the shift in the inspector's demeanor that followed. Yet it struck me to my core to witness this change, and I instinctively buried my face in my hands when I saw him approach Mr. Monroe to give some final instructions or a word of caution. In that moment, almost inexplicably, I found myself recalling a vivid scene from the supper room, one I had either witnessed or imagined. As it had that time, it opened up an entirely different view, separate from our current surroundings. I gazed once more at the dim shapes of a square of light, revealing an open space, partly obscured by a lifted curtain, and the tall figure of a man holding it back, seemingly looking down at his own chest, where he had already placed a trembling finger. What could that possibly signify? In the midst of the shocking events that had captivated all of us, I had entirely lost track of this strange experience. But now, feeling again the unsettling mix of shock and anticipation that seemed to come with it, I suddenly realized that the image I had seen in the dining room was likely a reflection in a glass or mirror of something happening somewhere beyond my sight. The significance hit me like a jolt when I remembered how critical the timing was. A man filled with dread, staring at his chest, just moments before the chaos erupted that had defined this night. A glimmer of hope, almost as intense as the despair I had just experienced, gave me the courage to lower my hands and rush toward the inspector. "Please, don't say anything yet. Don't judge any of us until you've heard what I have to share." Looking astonished and a bit stern, he asked what I had to say that I hadn't mentioned before. I spoke with all the passion of someone grasping at a slim chance, explaining that it was only now that I remembered something crucial that could significantly impact this case. Sensing a flicker of compassion in his expression, I added a plea for a moment alone with him, as what I needed to tell was personal and perhaps too strange for anyone else to hear. Though he seemed hesitant, as if concerned about wasting valuable time, he softened at my earnest request and led me to a corner, offering a brief encouraging glance toward Mr. Monroe, who seemed momentarily at a loss for words following my revelation. I shared with the inspector the fleeting image I had seen, now certain it had been reflected in either a window or a mirror. "It was just before or very shortly after the crime you're investigating," I concluded. "Within 5 minutes, there was the shout that alerted us all to what had taken place in the alcove. I can't recall the exact passage I saw, nor the door or even the specific figure, but I am convinced that the person I glimpsed was the one responsible. Something about the outline, though it was just a fleeting glimpse, conveyed an emotion that was beyond my understanding at that moment, but it now feels like fear and dread. I didn't see the entrance to the alcove itself, which would have caught my attention right away, but rather another opening that I might recognize if I saw it again. Can that opening be found? It may lead us to the man I saw slipping through it, filled with terror and guilt. Was this figure facing you, or turned away when you saw it? The inspector asked, with an unexpected intensity. Partly turned away. He was moving away from me. And you were sitting, where exactly? Should I show you? The inspector nodded, and with a quiet word of caution, addressed my uncle. I'm going to take this young lady into the hall for a moment, at her request. Could I ask you and Mr. Monroe to wait for me here? Without waiting for an answer, he opened the door, and soon we found ourselves walking through the empty dining room, searching for the spot where I had been seated. By some stroke of luck, amidst the chaos, I discovered it. My bouquet, which I had left behind during my hurried departure from the table, guided me to the correct chair. I confidently declared to the inspector. This is where I sat. Naturally, both our gazes shifted to the opposite wall. A window of unusual size and design stood before us. Unlike anything I had ever seen before, it swung on a pivot. Though it was closed at that moment, it could easily be swung open to reveal a large pane at an angle that would catch reflections from some of the many mirrors in the reception room diagonally across the hall. Since all the doorways on this floor were unusually wide, this created an open pathway for those reflections to travel, making it seem as if scenes happening here were as secure from observation as if they were taking place in the neighboring house. As we grasped this, a significant look exchanged between us. Pointing to the window, the inspector turned to a group of waiters observing us from the far side of the room and asked if it had been opened that evening. The answer came quickly. Yes, sir, just before the... I see, the inspector interrupted, leaning closer to me. Please tell me again exactly what you thought you saw. I struggled to add anything to my previous account. Perhaps you can help me with this, he gently urged. Was the image you saw at eye level, or did you have to look up to see it? It was high up, almost in the air. That struck me as the strangest part. The inspector's expression shifted to one of satisfaction. I might recognize the door and hall if I could see them, I suggested. Of course, he replied enthusiastically. He was about to call one of his men to give instructions when he paused and asked if I could draw. I replied, somewhat taken aback, that I wasn't very skilled at it, but I could probably manage a rough sketch. He then pulled out a pad and pencil from his pocket and asked me to try to recreate my memory of the passage and door on paper. My heart raced wildly, and my hand trembled around the pencil, but I knew I couldn't show any uncertainty as I captured what, for reasons I couldn't explain, remained clear to me. So I tried to follow his instructions and managed to do so to some degree. He let out a small gasp at one of the details, and while thanking me, gave me a piercing look. Is this your first time visiting this house? He asked. No, I've been here before. In the evening or in the afternoon? In the afternoon. I've heard the main entrance isn't in use tonight. No, a side door is provided for occasions like this. Guests who enter there find a special hall and staircase that leads to the upstairs dressing rooms without having to walk through the main hall. Is that what you mean? Yes, that's what I mean. I looked at him, puzzled. What was behind such questions? You came in, as others did, through this side entrance, he continued. Did you notice, when you turned to go upstairs, an arch that opens into a small passageway on your left? I didn't, I replied, feeling embarrassed, as I thought I understood what he was getting at. I was too eager to reach the dressing room to pay attention. That's fine, he said. I might want to show you that arch. The shape of an arch, backing the figure we were trying to identify, was a distinct feature in the sketch I had shown him. "Will you take a seat nearby, while I study this matter further?" I turned eagerly to comply. There was something in his demeanor that lifted my spirits. Had my imaginative take on what I'd seen resonated with him as strongly as it had with me? If that were the case, there was hope. Hope for the man I cared for, who had passed in and out through curtains, not through any arch he mentioned or that I had described. It felt like fate was working in my favor. I noticed it in the way the men moved around, swinging the window open and shut at the inspector's command, adjusting the lights, opening doors, and pulling back curtains. Fortune was on my side, and when, a few minutes later, I was invited to take my original seat at the supper table and glance again at the slightly warped glass, I knew my efforts had paid off. For the second time, I was about to witness a scene that would forever be etched in my memory. "Is this it?" asked the inspector, pointing at the glass and glancing down at the rough sketch I had made, which he still held. "Yes," I replied eagerly. "Everything matches except for the man. The figure reflecting there is someone entirely different. I don't see any remorse or even fear in his expression." "Of course not. You're looking at the reflection of one of my men. Miss Van Hayes, do you recognize the place before you now?" "I do not. You mentioned an arch in the hall to the left of the carriage entrance, and I see an arch in the window pane in front of me, but—" "You're looking straight through the alcove. Perhaps you weren't aware that there's another door at the back that leads into the passage behind it. Further along is the arch, and beyond that arch is the side hall and staircase leading to the dressing rooms. The door at the back of the alcove, the one I'm referring to, is concealed by drapes hung for this occasion. However, it's quite visible from the back passageway. There can be no doubt that the man whose reflection you saw entered and exited the alcove through that door. It is a crucial point to clarify, and we are genuinely grateful for the assistance you have provided in this matter." As I continued to look at him, filled with excitement and surprise, he added quickly, "The lights in the alcove and the various parlors are all fitted with shades, as you can see, but the one in the hall, beyond the arch, is very bright. That's why this double reflection stands out so clearly. There's another interesting detail. It wouldn't have been possible for you to notice that reflection from where you're seated if the floor of the alcove weren't considerably higher than the main floor. Without this quirk of the architect, the constant movement of people would have concealed the reflection as it traveled from surface to surface. Miss Van Hayes, it seems that, by a rare stroke of luck, all the conditions aligned perfectly at that moment to make this reflection noticeable, including the exact placement and width of the doorways, and the precise point at which the curtain was pulled aside at the alcove entrance. "It's amazing," I exclaimed, genuinely thrilled. Then, perhaps to his surprise, I asked, "Isn't there a small door connecting the passageway behind the alcove to the main hall?" "Yes," he responded. "It opens just past the fireplace. There are 3 small steps leading to it." "I thought so," I whispered, more to myself than to him. My mind was racing with the thought of how a person could slip from the center of this gathering into the quiet passageway, and then to the alcove, without drawing much attention from the other guests. I overlooked the fact that there was an even more discreet route via the small staircase that ascended just beyond the arch, leading directly to the dressing rooms. To clear up any confusion regarding these unusual matters, I've included a layout of this area of the lower floor, as it later appeared in the major newspapers. "And Mr. Monroe," I stammered, trailing the inspector back to the room where we had left him. "So you believe his statement now? Will you look for this second intruder with a guilty head hung low and a frightened expression?" "Yes," he replied, stopping me at the door and kindly taking my hand. Don't be startled, my dear. Life brings trouble to both young and old, and youth is the best time to confront difficult experiences. If he is not the very man you saw staring in terror at his own chest, have you noticed that he isn't dressed exactly like the other gentleman? Although he hasn't put on his overcoat, he's wearing, rather prematurely one might say, the large silk handkerchief he presumably keeps beneath it. Have you noticed this, and wondered why?" I had noticed it. The moment I came to after fainting, I saw it, but I hadn't considered it significant enough to question, even to myself, why he would choose to hide his shirt front. Now, however, I couldn't focus on anything except the consuming worry of what I would do if, through my own misguided eagerness, I had inadvertently dragged the man I loved deeper into the troubles that ensnared him. The inspector gave me no time to ponder this dilemma. He ushered me back into the room where Mr. Monroe and my uncle waited in seemingly unbroken silence, closed the door against the curious gazes of those still lingering in the hallway, and abruptly addressed Mr. Monroe. "Monroe, the explanations you've given about how you came to possess this diamond are entertaining enough to be believable, but there's another matter that has raised some concerns for one of my associates. Mr. Monroe, it seems you've made preparations to leave a bit too soon. Would you mind removing that handkerchief for a moment? The reason for such an unusual request will soon become clear." Alas, my last glimmer of hope. Mr. Monroe, his face as pale as the snow visible through the uncurtained window beside him, raised his hand as if to comply with the inspector's request, only to let it drop again with a harsh laugh. "I see I won't manage to escape the consequences of my foolishness," he exclaimed, and with a swift motion he pulled back his shirt front. A splash of red marred its otherwise pristine white surface. The fact that it was blood was obvious from the way he instinctively shrank away from it. Chapter 4. My love for Anson Monroe shattered at the sight of that crimson stain. I thought it had died. In that spot of blood on the chest of the man I had given my heart to, I could only see one thing: guilt, terrible guilt, guilt he denied that now lay exposed, plain for all to see. Why should I remain in his presence? Hadn't the inspector himself suggested I leave? Yes, but another voice urged me to stay. Just as I reached the door, Anson Monroe found his voice, and I heard the familiar, sweet tones I cherished so much. "Wait, I won't be judged like this. I need to explain." But the inspector interrupted him. "Do you think it wise to try explaining things without legal counsel, Mr. Monroe?" The anger with which Mr. Monroe turned toward him filled me with a glimmer of hope. "Good Lord, yes," he exclaimed. "Would you have me leave Miss Van Hayes in the grip of such dreadful uncertainty for a moment longer than necessary? Rita, Miss Van Hayes, only weakness has brought me to this point. I did not kill Mrs. Sinclair, nor did I knowingly take her diamond, though I readily acknowledge how it appears. I did go to her in the alcove not once, but twice, and here are my reasons. About 3 months ago, a wealthy and well-known man approached me, asking me to find him a diamond of exceptional beauty. He wanted to give it to his wife, and insisted that it must outshine any available in New York. This meant sending abroad, an expense he was more than willing to cover, provided the stone met his expectations when he saw it, and that it was in his hands by March 18th, his wife's birthday. Never before had I encountered such a chance for a significant business deal. Overjoyed, I immediately began communicating with the most reputable dealers across the way, and just last week, a diamond arrived that seemed to meet every one of my expectations. I had never encountered a more exquisite stone, and I was basking in my success when, by chance, someone mentioned in my presence the remarkable jewel owned by a certain Mrs. Sinclair, a gem so large, so brilliant, and so valuable that she rarely wore it. It was well known among enthusiasts, and had earned a great reputation at Tiffany, where it had previously been sent for adjustments to its setting. Was this stone larger and finer than the one I had so painstakingly acquired? If so, all my efforts would be for naught, as my patron must surely be aware of this diamond, and would expect something even more impressive. Distressed by the thought, I decided I had to see the jewel and make my own comparisons. I found a friend willing to introduce me to the lady. She welcomed me warmly and was quite pleasant until I brought up the topic of diamonds, at which point she suddenly became stiff and left me without allowing me to make my request. Nonetheless, on every other topic, she was friendly, and I found it easy to develop our acquaintance to a point where we were almost on friendly terms. But I never got to see the diamond, nor would she discuss it. I did manage to surprise her one day, though, by revealing the one I had acquired for my patron and asked her to take a look. "Beautiful, simply beautiful," she exclaimed. Yet I sensed no jealousy in her demeanor, which made it clear to me that I had not met the expectations set by my affluent customer. This realization was a crushing disappointment, still, as Mrs. Sinclair never wore her diamond, which left me hopeful that he might be pleased with the exquisite gem I had acquired for him. Encouraged by this thought, I sent him a note this morning asking him to come see it tomorrow. Tonight, I attended the ball, and just as I stepped into the drawing-room, I heard that Mrs. Sinclair was present and showcasing her renowned jewel. What could I do but try to catch a glimpse of it? After all, I wanted to be ready with a response from my demanding client when he asked me tomorrow if the stone I showed him had a rival in the city. Yet, I wasn't in the drawing-room at that moment, and when I finally became interested in my surroundings. Here, I glanced at you. Much of the evening had passed before I managed to join her in the so-called alcove, where she had gathered her little court. If needed, I can recount the details of our brief encounter. It was mainly defined by the fleeting glimpse I managed to catch of her stunning diamond, despite her efforts to keep it hidden with subtle movements whenever I directed my gaze away from her face. But in that one moment, I had seen enough. This was a gem for a collector, not something to be worn except in front of royalty. How had she come into possession of it? And could Mr. Smythe actually expect me to find him a stone like that? In my confusion, I prepared to leave, but the lady seemed intent on keeping me there. She started chatting so animatedly that I hardly noticed she was busily removing her gloves. In fact, I almost forgot about the jewel entirely, perhaps because her movements concealed it so well. I only remembered it when, with a sudden turn from the window, where she had drawn me to watch the falling snowflakes, she slipped the gloves into my hand with a playful request to take care of them for her. I remember, as I took my leave, trying to catch one last glimpse of the stone that had so captivated me, but she had opened her fan between us. Moments later, thinking I heard footsteps approaching, I left the room. This was my first visit. As he paused, either to catch his breath or to gauge how much his story had affected me, the inspector seized the moment to ask if Mrs. Sinclair had been facing away from him the whole time. He confirmed that she had while they were by the window. Long enough for her to remove the jewel and slip it into her gloves, if she had wanted to. Absolutely. But you didn't see her do that. No, I did not. So you took the gloves without any suspicion. Completely. And you took them away. Regrettably, yes. Without considering that she might need them right after. I doubt I was thinking much about her at all. My mind was on my own disappointment. Did you carry the gloves in your hand? No, I placed them in my pocket. I understand, and you encountered. No one. The noise I heard must have come from the back hall. And there was nobody on the steps. No, a gentleman was standing at the bottom, Mr. Harper, the Englishman, but he had his back to me, and he looked as though he had been in that position for several minutes. Did this gentleman, Mr. Harper, notice you? I cannot say, but I doubt it. He seemed lost in thought. There were others around, but none I recognized. Very well. Now, about the second visit you admit to making to this unfortunate lady. The inspector's tone was stern. I clung a little more tightly to my uncle, and Mr. Monroe, after casting a pained glance in my direction, straightened himself, fully aware that he was now entering the most serious part of the inquiry. I had forgotten the gloves in my hasty exit, but soon I remembered them and grew quite anxious. I wasn't pleased to be carrying this woman's belongings around with me. Just an hour earlier, I had promised Miss Van Hayes that I would find her, and I was eager to reunite with her. The gloves were beginning to bother me, so after wandering aimlessly through the various rooms for a bit, I decided to return them to their owner. The supper-room doors had just been thrown open, and the area near the alcove was fairly empty, except for a certain friend of mine, who sat on the yellow divan with his partner. I didn't want to run into him at that moment, as he had already teased me about my fascination with the lady wearing the diamond. So I thought it best to approach her through another entrance to the alcove, one that most people wouldn't notice, but which I knew well as a frequent guest in the house. There was a door, concealed by temporary drapery, that linked this alcove to a passageway directly connected to the entrance hall and the upstairs dressing rooms. It was easy for me to go up the main stairs, then down the side staircase, passing through a small archway. As long as there were no guests arriving or leaving in the entrance hall, I really only had to worry about one encounter with the servant stationed at the carriage entrance. Luckily, he wasn't around at that moment, and I made it to the door I was aiming for without any trouble. I had planned for this door to swing out rather than in, something I kept in mind as I prepared for my stealthy entry. However, once I pulled it open and reached for the curtain that hung across it, I realized it wasn't as simple as I had thought. The secretive nature of my action made my hand hesitate. Then I heard faint sounds from within, which hinted that she was not alone. It dawned on me that my sudden entrance through a door she might not even know about could be met with disapproval. I share all this because if anyone saw me hesitating in front of that curtain, it might raise questions that I'm eager to clear up. With that, his gaze shifted from me to the inspector. It certainly looked suspicious, I won't deny that. But at that moment, I wasn't focused on appearances. I was too eager to finish a task that had suddenly become more complicated. It felt perfectly natural to listen before going in, and when I heard no voice, just what sounded like a deep sigh, I took the chance to lift the curtain and step inside. She was sitting not where I had left her, but on a couch to the left of the usual entrance, facing me. You know how it goes, Inspector. That sigh was her last. I froze in horror, having never witnessed death before, let alone a crime. I stumbled forward, intending to rush down the steps to call for help, when suddenly something splashed onto my shirt. I looked down to see a bloodstain spreading across the fabric. It both scared and confused me, and it took me a minute or two to gather the courage to look up again. When I finally did, I saw the source of the drop. It wasn't from her, even though blood was streaming down the rich folds of her dress. It was from a sharp, needle-like tool that had been thrust point down into the openwork of an antique lantern hanging near the doorway. What happened to me could have happened to anyone in that spot at that moment, but I didn't realize that then. Covering the bloodstain with my hands, I slowly retreated to the door through which I had entered, keeping my eyes on those lifeless orbs and stepping carefully over the remnants of broken china scattered across the carpet. I hardly thought of her, and barely of myself. To cross the room was all I needed to do. I wanted to escape as quietly as I'd come, before the nearly closed curtain could be disturbed by someone curious entering the main hall. This was my first encounter with blood, my first brush with crime, and so I ran. The last word escaped my lips in a gasp. Clearly, this horrible experience had a profound effect on him. "I'm ashamed of myself," he mumbled, "but nothing can change what happened." I slipped away from the presence of the murdered woman as if I were the one responsible for her death, or greedily wanting something from her. Fortunately, I made it to the dressing room before the alarm drew attention beyond the alcove. There, I found and put on the handkerchief that allowed me to rush down and check on Miss Van Hayes, who someone told me had fainted. It wasn't until I stood over her in that quiet corner past the supper room that I remembered the gloves. You already know how I reacted when I finally thought of them. I couldn't have shown more cowardice if I had known that the murdered woman's diamond was hidden inside. Yet I had no idea, nor did I even suspect it. I still don't understand why she chose to hide it there. Why would Mrs. Sinclair risk such a precious gem with someone she barely knew? An unconscious act, too. Was she afraid of being murdered if she kept the jewel with her? The inspector paused for a moment and then asked, "You mentioned your fear of someone coming in through the door before you could escape through the other. Were you referring to the friend you left on the divan?" No, my friend had already left that spot. The curtain was drawn back enough for me to see that. If I had just waited a minute longer, he said bitterly, I would have found my way to the main entrance and avoided all of this. Monroe, you're not required to answer any of my questions, but if you'd like, you can share whether you were at all concerned about being seen by one of the many coachmen passing by outside just now. No, I didn't even think about the window. I'm not sure why, but if someone did see me, I hope they saw enough to support my story. The inspector didn't respond. He seemed lost in thought. I later learned that the curtains, which had been pulled back earlier in the evening, were found hanging completely over the window by those who first arrived at the scene. Was he trying to catch Mr. Monroe in a lie, or was he merely probing for the truth? His face revealed nothing of his thoughts, and Mr. Monroe, noticing this, replied with a hint of dignity. "I don't expect strangers to accept my explanations, which must sound strange and inadequate compared to the evidence I have of being with that woman after the weapon struck her heart. But to those who know me well, I can surely appeal for belief in a story I declare to be as true as if I were swearing to it in court." "Anson," I exclaimed passionately, releasing my grip on my uncle's arm. My confidence in him had returned, but as I observed the inspector's serious demeanor and my uncle's uncertain expression, my heart swelled. Disregarding all caution, I eagerly stepped forward. Taking Mr. Monroe's hands in mine, I declared fervently, "I believe in you. Nothing will ever shake my faith in your innocence." The warm, grateful smile he gave in response was the best reply I could have hoped for. After that, I felt ready to leave the room, but not the house. Another revelation awaited me, awaited all of us, before this long, eventful evening came to an end.